When I was around preschool age, either a teacher or a daycare worker gathered us up for story time and we read A Bad Case of Stripes. The cover art seemed silly enough, depicting a girl with rainbow skin, but by the time the story was finished, I was petrified. The girl in the story had contracted some mysterious disease, turning her skin into different patterns and colors until eventually transforming her whole body into something completely unrecognizable as human. Sure, a lot of this was meant to be funny, but it was undoubtedly a form of body horror, and my first exposure to it. Being a very young kid who couldn't quite tell the difference between reality and fantasy, it was horrifying to think that this could happen. I was wearing rainbow socks the same day that we read that, and around that time I just pulled them off and refused to touch them because I thought they could somehow give me this infection. Throughout elementary school, I tried to reread the book many different times, hoping I'd eventually overcome this fear, but every time I just scared myself all over again. For a lot of my childhood since reading this book, I was very scared of diseases and body horror, even if it was completely fictional and unrealistic. The 2012 Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, for example, really scared me whenever someone or something was transformed with mutagen, particularly when the Pulverizer got turned into Mutagen Man. I also have a more embarrassing fear of these things. So these fears dominated a lot of my youth and caused me a lot of distress, but as most people do, I've grown out of it. There are still a few things that bother me, but for the most part, this experience actually made me develop a morbid fascination with horror and the horror genre. Nowadays, I can look back on these stories detached from the fear I used to have, and that means I can finally read A Bad Case of Stripes all over again. The story follows a girl named Camilla who really likes lima beans but doesn't want to admit it to her peers since most kids find them gross. When she's getting ready for the first day of school, she realizes her skin has turned into rainbow stripes. She's examined by a doctor, but it doesn't seem to be any illness they know of, so she's sent to school the next day. While at school, her skin begins to change patterns according to her environment. Over time, these transformations get more outrageous, causing objects to protrude from her body or transforming her entirely, all while she and her doctors are helpless to stop it. The severity reaches its peak when a therapist tells her to become one with the room, and her body literally melts into the walls and turns her into the bedroom, while her parents stare horrified at what her daughter has become. Among the doctors and news reporters, a random old lady shows up. The old lady determines that Camilla is hiding her true self by denying her love for lima beans, and it's when she eats the lima beans offered by the old woman that she finally returns to her normal self and decides to live her truth without shame. I actually find this book to be very interesting now that my judgment isn't clouded by fear. As a kid, I never really picked up on what it was trying to tell me, since I was mostly just focused on the visuals. The story is meant to symbolize what happens when you conform to others' desires and sacrifice what you love in order to appease people. By turning into the things people tell her to be or what's mentioned around her, she becomes completely unrecognizable from her authentic self. It's only when she lives her truth that she can be freed from this illness and find happiness. It's a really good book with a great message. It's just that the art to accompany it may have scarred a few kids like me. I think it's the art style that really makes this concept so disturbing. The general idea of what's going on and the idea of what it looks like is very silly, but the art style isn't so much. It's not necessarily realistic, it's just very detailed and uncanny because of it. I assume the artwork is all painted for this book, and while its quality is magnificent, the colors look a certain way, like it's a little too dark or contrasted than it should be. It's a great look, but a little unnerving for what it's for. One example from the book is when the doctors are standing above her discussing what kind of illness this could be. As they mention the possibility of it being bacteria or a virus, tendrils start coming out of her body resembling those things. We don't see what she looks like, we just see from her perspective as the doctor stared down at her in horror, and we're left to only guess what she must look like with only a glimpse of what's coming off her. These tendrils really should be silly. They're very cartoonish in design, but because the artist adds so much detail to the scene, coupled with the shading on the doctor's scared faces, it becomes frightening. Though I should note that the helplessness of the situation, knowing there's not a single person that could possibly help this girl, adds to the dread of it all. If my younger self met the author and illustrator David Shannon, I might have said I hated him for causing years worth of anxiety, but I kind of admire his work now. Childhood fears aren't something you enjoy in the moment, since it brings a lot of very real distress. But as I've gotten older and more desensitized to horror media, I've become interested in that visceral fear of things you're too young to understand. Like many things kids are scared of, I don't think this book was meant to be scary. I think that was an accident, but it intrigues me to see what unintentionally disturbed our young minds. I think I'm drawn to this naive, irrational fear because it's something teens and adults probably won't feel the same way now that they've matured. I've come to realize that though I've associated this book with negative feelings for so long, it's been very significant in my life, whether I wanted it to be or not. It's been quite the inspiration for me now that I myself am an artist interested in the horror genre. So I guess I should thank David Shannon for being my first introduction to it, even if it was on accident.